this is going to be a question and answer framework. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask each of the panelists to briefly introduce themselves and their... Yep, that's perfect. To briefly introduce themselves and explain what their role in the solitary reform campaign or movement is, and then we'll open it up for questions.
My name is Angad, and I directed Herman's House along and produced it with Lisa, and we've been working on it. Well, we started working on it in the June of 2007, to give you some time frame, but we finished it about a little over a year ago. So it was a journey for sure, but we're super excited that it's come to fruition.
First, I have to thank you all for coming out tonight. My name is Mualammik. I am with the NJC and also the Campaign for Alternatives to Isolated Confinement. I myself was incarcerated for 12 years. I did 5 years in solitary. When my sentence was somewhat overturned, I was released into society to fight. So I've been home for about a year now, fighting.
I'm Bob White. I'm director of the New York State Council of Churches, which last year took a strong policy position against solitary confinement, against excessive isolation in the state prisons. We certify and support the Protestant chaplains working in state institutions, a majority of which are working in the prisons, and they quietly verify for us the truth of the inhumane and torturous conditions that are imposed on people by this horrendous practice. I'm also representing tonight the National Religious Campaign Against Torture, which is a national agency that has made solitary confinement one of its chief goals to overcome and hopefully eliminate. They are working in 13 states. It's their resources that raised our consciousness as churches in this state about what's going on, and they are a tremendous resource. I brought some of their resources, and it's on the side table if they can be helpful to you.
Hi, I'm Maria Pagano, and I'm the managing attorney at Prisoners Legal Services of New York in Buffalo. We have 3 other offices, one in Albany, one in Plattsburgh, and one in Ithaca. We are a nonprofit law office. We are prisoners' rights attorneys, and we try to get our clients out of solitary confinement. We have clients who are teenagers, 16 and 17 years old. We have clients who are blind, who are deaf, who are disabled, and have been locked up for years. And I just wanted to thank you for the beautiful, inspiring film. Thank you.
Thank you for the work you do as well.
Hi, everyone. I'm Scott Paltrowitz. I work at the Correctional Association of New York. We're an independent nonprofit group based in Harlem, and we have a legislative mandate to allow us to go and investigate conditions in prisons across the state, and then we use that power to advocate for change. One of the campaigns we're working on is related to solitary confinement, but we work on a lot of other issues facing people who are incarcerated. I'm also part of the Campaign for Alternatives to Isolated Confinement that 5 mentioned. Actually, everybody I think sitting up on this panel is a part of that campaign, and I hope that before you leave today, if you're interested in joining in a movement to really try to transform how solitary confinement operates in our state, that you will sign up at the back on the sign-up sheet. Hope you'll be involved. Thanks.
Also, I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Nate Vogel, Legislative Counsel at the New York Civil Liberties Union. And so again, if you have questions, please come up to the microphone. But I'd like to start with a question for the panelists, whoever would like to answer it. I'm hoping someone can talk about the current solitary confinement system in New York. So maybe start in broad terms. So if we can start, whoever wants to answer it, but we could start at that end of the panel.
As a brief introduction, I mean, there's 4 big things that I would like to say. There are way too many people who are in solitary confinement in New York State. They're in for way too long. There are vulnerable groups of people who are in solitary that was just mentioned a few minutes ago, and the conditions are as inhumane as you can imagine. So for each of those things, as we're sitting here tonight, there are nearly 4,400 people in New York State prisons alone who are in solitary confinement. Now that doesn't even count county jails or city jails. And people are in not for a few days, but for typically many months, often many years, and just as with Herman Wallace for decades, recently was interacting with an individual at 5 Points Correctional Facility who's been in solitary confinement for 30 years. And it's not an unusual circumstance. I mean, it's unusual, but it happens regularly in New York State. And like with Herman, people are in their cell 23 or 24 hours a day. They have no access to programs, no meaningful human interaction. People are not even allowed to make phone calls oftentimes. And people are stuck in a cell 23 hours a day. The 1 hour they have is for recreation. For many of the people, that recreation takes place in a cage that's in the back of their cell. It's like a balcony off of the cell, so they don't even actually leave their cell to go to recreation. For other people, they do go off their cell, but it's in another cage. And for many people, they choose not to go to recreation because of the treatment that they may experience by correction officers on the way, or because they're in, unfavorable weather conditions and such, and so they end up 24 hours a day.
I'd just like to talk briefly about how people wind up in solitary confinement in New York State, and also to talk a little bit about administrative segregation and involuntary protective custody, because basically there's 3 names for the same thing, being locked up in a cage 23 hours a day. But in New York, when people come into prison, if they break a prison rule or they're alleged to break a rule, and it's considered a serious rule, they're given a ticket. And they're given what is called a fair hearing. And the hearings are run by a hearing officer. They have very limited rights at these hearings. We look at the hearings to find legal arguments because we're lawyers. So we're looking for legal arguments to try to overturn the hearing, reverse the hearing, get them out of solitary. But the rules that they are accused of breaking can be anything from being out of line, stealing an orange from the commissary, assaulting an officer. They vary. And the amount of evidence that's necessary to put a person in solitary the standard is incredibly low. It's basically some evidence. So if you think about beyond a reasonable doubt, no way. Preponderance, no way. It's some evidence. So once a person is found to be guilty of a prison rule, it's extremely difficult to get them out legally, which is why I really have to say that the power of the artist is something that I think is so important for us all to remember and to be able to imagine and have a vision of a different way of doing things. Because the legal challenges, although we try our best, we need the artists and the community people and everybody to be involved in the fight.
I was one of 4 clergy persons who met with Commissioner Brian Fisher last December to express the concerns of the interfaith community about extreme isolation. And I was struck by the very different culture that he presides over and that must exist in the Department of Corrections. He was unable to acknowledge our concern. He was unable to acknowledge that anything resembling solitary confinement happens in New York State prisons because our system is so enlightened and so beneficial to those who fall under its sway. At one point in the conversation, he said, the way we use the shoe is as a grandparent would say to an overactive grandchild, go sit in your timeout chair for a little while until you calm down. He did acknowledge that people in the shoe receive no services, no programs, no external stimulation or help, but seemed comfortable with that fact. Now, last night I met with a senior corrections administrator who was meeting with a group of prisoner families in Albany. He said he's on a new task force to reevaluate. The first subject of many that he brought up was the shoe. For some curious reason, he said he's on a task force, that they are reviewing procedures, that now people suffering from substance abuse issues get treatment even in the shoe, and so a whole new look is happening. I don't know to what extent that's valid or true, but I do know that whatever is happening because of the pressure of people like us constantly raising this issue and re-raising it and raising consciousness in the society.
Thank you. I would just like to say that solitary confinement is torture, and until we realize the inhumane effects of it and how it affects humans, and then you go into looking into why a person is in solitary. So, being that we're in this great state of New York, and the reason why we focus on New York, because New York is somewhat the financial center of the world. We're the fashion center of the world. We're also the torture capital of the world. We have more jails per land mass size than anywhere on the planet. We also incarcerate more at a faster rate than anywhere. When you say that we're the leader for the country, it's primarily because, we have 2.5 million people incarcerated in America. And I always tell people, if you take Lithuania and Germany and Berlin and put them together, we still have more. And then you add in Iraq and China also, we still have more. So we have 4% of the world's population with 25% of the world's incarcerated rate. And New York is the leader for that. So when I say New York has a special brand of torture, it's because a lot of laws, felon disenfranchisement laws, started in New York State. We have the oldest jails in New York State, Auburn Correctional Facility, which was once a colonial jail. And when, from the inside, it's a different form of view. When you say, oh, slight tickets. I'm talking about you're allowed to have 50 postage stamps. So if you have 51 stamps, you're going to the box. If you leave the mess hall with a pack of sugar, you're going to the box. I'm not talking about stealing from commissary, I'm talking about stealing from the mess hall. If you take extra food, you're going to the box. So, slight rule breaks should not be a reason for extreme isolation. And I say extreme isolation in the prison industrial complex, which is what I call it, because we're selling facilities to private corporations. We are keeping facilities full to buy in contracts to sell them for a profit. And these industrial businesses, in some sense, are making money. And of course, it's the people of the state that pay for it. It's tax dollars. They have employees, and these employees are paid 60 cents an hour, the cheapest wage labor in the world. And why? They make 100% profit off of the products they make. And solitary is the punishment for that, It's hard to talk about solitary because there's nothing good about it to speak about, So when you say lack of programming, you mean there is no educational services. You're not allowed to have a certain amount of literature. It has to go through media review. Recreation is literally a cage. I don't know if you understand the concept of a cage, but it's literally a cage. And that recreation, if it comes, maybe you get a shower once or twice a week. So New York has different types of torture, like food torture. Of course, you have the loaf, you have certain rules involving food torture. So we are the leaders of the country when it comes to different forms of torture, and we have to be better. New York can be better, New York can be greater on that. And until we change the rules that allow this torture to continue, it's not going to change the world. And we're still going to incarcerate at a high rate. So I'm grateful for films like this on solitary, because there are none. Nobody talks about that. People in solitary are the forgotten people. It's like the dungeon of imprisonment. And you always assume that, oh, they're bad people, so it's okay for them to be there. But it's not that. When you see, even if you just pick up the book on the way out, boxed in, and you see the reports of how many people and what the charges are, it's ridiculous to be in extreme isolation. The damage is a psychological damage. And I'm not just talking about full-grown adults who are adults with a full working cerebral cortex that can make constructive decisions. I'm talking about 14, 15, 16-year-olds, children, you know, the average 10th grader, are doing 23 hours in a box, no schooling, no recreation. And this has to stop, but it's only going to take the people demanding it for it to stop.
Maria, you mentioned that one of the great things about this film is that it shows it shows the power of connecting art, of using art to look at solitary confinement through a new, fresh perspective. And I was wondering if we could talk more about looking at solitary confinement through various perspectives. And I was wondering, in particular, I was wondering if Reverend Wright would be willing to talk about the faith community's perspective on solitary confinement, what perspective the faith community brings.
Thank you. Solitary confinement to people of faith is not only inhumane, cruel, torturous, it's also a sacrilege. It's an affront, an insult to the God whom we believe made all people with an essential dignity to be respected always. But also, we are created always to be in community, the great world religions say. The Torah begins with the book of Genesis, the story of creation, and God creates a single human being and says, no, I'm not done yet. It is not good that the man should be alone. That's the word for how we are nurtured, how we are brought into existence through a communal relation. We are nurtured, hopefully. We are also held accountable by a community. So it is a sacrilege to take a person out of community and all of its resources and isolate them. It is abhorrent. It is torturous and a form of death. That's how the religious community, why the religious community responds so strongly to this particular injustice in a world that's filled with them. There's a particular heinousness about making someone be so alone. And the film captures that. All the relationships that even Herman, that kept him human and kept him alive, are highlighted there. How much more rich his life would have been if that cage had not kept him from those people who loved him so much.
Thank you. All of you have probably had experiences with trying to approach, well, I'll save this question if you'd like to ask a question.
Yeah, I would. I'm Stanley Yake. I'm a philosopher who teaches ethics. At one point, I taught in the prison outside of Green Bay, Wisconsin, in Green Bay. There was mention of rules, and I think it doesn't actually have to do with rules. It has to do with the power inside the prison that controls who makes a decision and who can overturn the decision of somebody who says, no, you got to go into that solitary confinement. And my grasp of things is that the power games are just enormous, and that's where the contrary power needs to be somehow. So that's one thought. I have another thought that at one point talked to the substance abuse director, suggesting that we need drug courts. not just ordinary courts. And one of the things that I wondered about was whether all the convictions were the same kinds of convictions, the reasons for incarcerations were all the same, or you end up in solitary confinement because of certain kinds of convictions or not. And I wondered whether the drug business isn't very, very important in all that somehow. But anyway.
Well, just to clarify, people don't go into solitary confinement because of their conviction or their sentence. I'm not saying that the sentence or conviction may not follow them into prison because a correctional facility will be aware of what a person's crime is, but putting people in solitary is something that happens once a person gets into prison and is found to have broken a rule.
A prison chaplain told me of an inmate that came back from a work day, with a piece of chicken that he saved from his lunch. He was caught with that piece of chicken and put in the shoe for 6 months. Or 51 stamps instead of 50. It is trivial, it is arbitrary, and it's often the result of racism and animosities like that.
I just wanted to comment on your comments, sir. The institutions of quote-unquote correctional facilities, which doesn't correct anybody, it doesn't facilitate any correctional activities. So these are based on rules of discipline and order because you are property of the state, just like the 13th Amendment says that, 13th Amendment states that you're a slave and that slavery will continue if you are committed of a crime in your state. So saying that you have to abide, being property of the state, you're a ward of the state, you have to abide by rules and regulations of that facility. So rules and regulations are what articulate the charge to be placed in punitive segregation, in some sense, solitary confinement, extreme isolation. So if you are in your programming schedule of school and you have to use the bathroom and you go to the bathroom, you don't take the hall, then technically you're out of place, which is a 106.1, then technically that's a tier 2, and then you put that on as disruptive behavior, then you're going to the box. If you have unnecessary property, which you might have too many t-shirts, too many stamps, too much food, you're going to the box. So these are disciplinary measures inside a facility which doesn't articulate what a person's original arrest charge is. Of course, there is specific instances where people are abusing drugs, and this is why we suggest change in the fact of looking toward more into what the person has done to commit those charges before you put them in extreme isolation. What are you taking to repair the notion of that? You know, I've seen, I shared this with some people earlier, I've seen this form of, therapy with solitary work, and it worked perfectly well, actually. When I came home, a few friends tried to get me back into social activities, so they took me to a hockey game. You've seen the hockey game, and the guy gets into a fight in the hockey floor, and two guys come up and grab him up and put him in this little penalty box for 3 minutes. And they put him in the box, and he sits there, and he comes right back out and tears right back on the ice and beats the guy up again. So solitary does work, and it just has those, basically, repercussions. But what it does do is it's like a disease. So a disease in a dictionary described as something that comes in contact with your body that affects you and leaves a lasting effect. And this is what solitary does. After 15 days, it does psychological damage, does neurological damage. It causes schizophrenia. It causes post-traumatic stress disorder. It causes antisocial personality disorder. You become displaced. You have sensory deprivation. These are all torture techniques. And of course, you have to understand that the United Nations doesn't allow other countries to do this to other people. So, but we do it.
I still find myself still immersed and captivated by the film. So I was hoping we could take a few minutes. I'd really like to hear from the filmmaker and maybe your producer. I'm very curious, just like, how did you meet Jackie, and how did you get these phone conversations recorded, and just the mechanics, and I'd love to hear more about how the film came into being.
Sure. So I knew Jackie. I met Jackie first. She was kind of my entry to this story. I didn't know much about solitary or political prisoners, but we were both activists, and she explained to me, she told me about this project, and I thought it was, I thought it was interesting, but I didn't necessarily right away think I would make a film about it. And then several years passed. When we first met, it was about 2002, 2003, that time, and then in 2007, the project had grown and was starting to be shown in galleries and stuff. And one of the galleries put out a book of letters that some of their correspondence that they'd been doing to work on the project for these years. And when I read the book, I was like, wow, this is a really interesting friendship. And I think at the heart of it, that was what I thought the film was about. I mean, there's art and there's prisons and there's imagination, there's all these things, but in the end it's about friendships and relationships, largely between Herman and Jackie, but even other friends he's made. But I also, what was difficult was I knew pretty much from day one that they were not going to give me access to Herman and to this unit. And I don't know if I know there's, because they make documentaries here. That's like the first rule of documentaries, like access. You have to, you need to see things. So that made it, that made it hard to think about making the film. But I still thought there was something interesting here. And when I first spoke to Herman is fortunate in that way, is that he does have phone access, like on his 1 hour out of the cell. He not only has, though not the whole time, not for the 40 years, there's been periods where he's had it and periods where it's taken away. But I mean, more or less, the majority, at least since I've known him, he's had phone access. So I spoke to him on the phone and I was like, oh wow, he's a very captivating person, even just in his voice. Like maybe I could make this film just with these audio recordings on his phone, and luckily I got on his phone list kind of very early on in the filmmaking process, where I was just recording them, and there was no like public notion of making a film, because a lot of journalists unfortunately have been denied access to view these cells and to even talk to people who've been in them. And so that's like another form of censorship that's been happening not only in Louisiana but everywhere else, even in New York. And so I was, but I was already on his phone list, so they couldn't, I was like a friend on his phone list, so they couldn't actually do anything about it. And then, I thought that this would be a really interesting way of talking about prisons, because I think, most of the time we hear about prisons or we watch prison films or anything, we're always talking about crime and punishment, and those are kind of the frameworks how we look at things. And I felt their art project really made it about living spaces and friendships and things that we're not used to seeing with prisons. So that was the real effort with the film. It was super difficult to make a film where you didn't know when the interview would happen, because it was like when he got access to the phone. The phone calls are only 15 minutes in length, so you can't, it's not like when you sit down and interview someone for 3 hours and have follow-up conversations. So these are all these 15-minute phone calls that we had to that we've recorded over years, that we kind of spliced together to create the narrative. And then he was phone calls, phone privileges, even while I was working on the film, those 4 years or so, he lost phone privileges all the time, for a week here, 2 weeks there, and at one point almost, months, 8 months or something. And often, he was already in the box. So it was like they were always looking for something to take away, and that was like all he had left, so he wouldn't even, so it was whatever, it was all the same things they were talking about. Once it was because he had an African looking necklace in his cell, like it was just like looked African, and that was political or something, I mean, it was just like ridiculous things, and there'd be these kangaroo courts, and it was everything they were talking about, what gets you in solitary. I mean, these are just the ways that they kind of control the prison system. But, Overall, I still thought that even without the access, we could tell an interesting story. So, I just kept recording the calls and seeing what I would get.
Hi, my name is Anastasia. A couple of things. Just when you were just speaking and you were talking about how people end up in solitary confinement, and you were talking about the kangaroo court system, so to speak. I don't really think of solitary confinement as something that is done because you've really broken a rule, but more of a matter of control. It seems we have prisons within prisons. So it seems like the more out of line, so to speak, seems to me, basically in the way you think, if it's not in step with what's going on, or you're not willing to fold, so to speak, then it's easier to deal with you by locking you away for 23 hours out of a day versus leaving you in general pop and dealing with you as such. Because when the infractions are as minor and as trivial as they can be, there has to be another reason. There has to be something else. And we all know the prison system is a much bigger thing than just incarcerating bad people. One of my questions is, this is upstate New York. We have communities, whole communities up here, entire families work in the prison systems. These communities thrive because of the prison system. And now that we've gone into privatization of prison systems, what can actually be done to... These communities are not going to be willing to say, well, we're into the business of rehabilitating people and so forth, because this is how we make our livelihood. This is how we buy our homes. This is how we buy our cars. This is how we put our kids through college and so forth and on. And, and we also have a system built in where we know that fourth grade test scores are being used to determine how many prisons need to be built in the future. It's a whole systematic thing. So I appreciate what the film does, and I think it's a real enlightenment, because even for someone like myself, it sparks the interest. It sparks you to want to say, well, I'm aware of this situation, but what more can be done?
Can I just comment on that? First of all, thank you for raising that very valid fact. Number one, I just want to say that I love this country, and I feel like this country can be better, because if you've ever been outside this country, then you really love this country. Number one, America is addicted to incarceration off the top. We are addicted to relying and being somewhat dependable on the incarceration system. So you have whole towns that thrive off of the business of incarceration. From the facility itself, my brother works here, my sister works here, my uncle works here. So when you look at inmates, you're not looking at prisoners, you're not looking at people who are cast out from society. You're looking at an investment for your own future. You're looking at job stability. You're looking at, hey, my son just filled out an application yesterday, and I need you to stay here. So you have towns. Not only do you have towns, you have businesses that thrive off of that, where you have these structures of trades that the state gives you in some sense. And those trade businesses are contracted to the city facility, and their employees are, of course, convicts, and they have employee rates, they have great medical coverage thanks to you, the taxpayers, and they also have a facility to live in. And then these facilities are kept whole and sold. If you are familiar with Lake Erie, which was sold to GEO Corporation, and they made $37 million in profits that same year. So it's you that are supporting these prisons. So what we have to do is break that addiction in some sense. We have to look outside of what we're doing to depend on these prisons, as far as businesses, as far as corporations, as far as keeping them full, because it's a 2-year contract that you have to keep the jail full, in a sense, in order to sell it. So you have to keep it full. So you're keeping the people in. But what do they keep it in? They keep it in your families. They keep it in your neighbors. And they're incarcerating these same towns. So towns thrive off of it. At one point in time, the federal government was getting money off of the population rate of the prisons. So we have to break that addiction to incarceration in some sense. And I feel like, where can we start at that? Why not start where everything else starts, in New York? We have to be the example in New York to say, no, we're not gonna incarcerate our own, and no, we're not gonna profit off of it. How do we do that? By changing the rules of what we consider humane and setting the standards for others to follow, because everybody follows what New York State does. Sorry, just opinion. Thank you. Yes.
Just to piggyback off a little what Five said. I want to say a few things, but I want to start by saying that I view solitary confinement as an extension of the system of mass incarceration that we have in this country and in this state. And I also view solitary as a window into challenging that broader system. So solitary is inhumane and it's ineffective, and the prison system is inhumane and ineffective. But I think that we can use solitary as an entry point into a broader community of people who will be able to see the inhumanity of solitary and the prison system. And so at the Campaign for Alternatives to Isolated Confinement, what we're trying to do is push an agenda that says 4 basic things. One is that we need to end long-term isolation. So nobody should be in longer than what the Special Rapporteur has said can amount to torture, which is 15 days. So rather than 30 years, 15 days should be the maximum length anybody's in. That's one. Number 2 is that we need to vastly restrict the criteria that could allow anybody to get in even for 1 day. So related to your question, it should be only for the most violent conduct or the most destructive conduct imaginable that could lead somebody even to get 1 day in. So again, decrease the length of time, restrict the criteria, which by the way, by restricting the criteria, you would restrict that number. So rather than talking about 4,400 people, we would be talking about a handful of people potentially. The third thing is that certain vulnerable groups should not spend even 1 day in solitary. The 400 people who are under the age of 21 in New York State right now who are in solitary should never be put in solitary even for 1 day. And people with mental health needs should not be put in solitary. Pregnant women who are near giving birth are put in solitary. They should not be put in solitary confinement. And then the fourth thing is, and I think this relates to the window into the broader system of incarceration, also relates to your question, is that we need to fundamentally transform how we respond to what is deemed as rule violations or as problematic behavior. If somebody, and because there are situations where people do engage in problematic behavior, but the response should not be deprivation. It should not be isolation. It should be the opposite. Those people who commit behavior that we deem as problematic need more support, more programs, more therapy, more services, more time out of their cell, more social interaction that can help them to thrive rather than to allow them to deteriorate further. And I think that's a window into the broader system of mass incarceration as well, because once we can get into that vein, that's how we should work with people inside who engage in problematic behavior, the same holds true for people outside. When people engage in problematic behavior in our communities, the response should not be separation and placement in prison and deprivation that happens there, but additional support and programming and encouragement for growth. And I just want to add one other thing to this, and I'm sorry if I'm going on too long. This film, I've seen it a few times now. As I saw it this time, it really came out to me even more that this film is not just about solitary confinement. It's also about young people incarcerated. It's also about elderly people incarcerated and the ridiculousness of somebody who's 70 years old, who's been incarcerated for 40 years, who has become an inspiration to so many people, certainly is not a threat to anybody in society, and rather has transformed his life to be such an inspiring figure that we need to look at our policies of parole, and I know there are people in this room who are doing a lot of work related to that. We need to look at our policies of sentencing, and we need to look at our policies of keeping people in prison well beyond any reasonable justification for it. So thanks for the question, and I said last point, but this is also my last point, which is this film is also not about incarceration, as I think you said. It's about humanity and it's about relationships. And for me, it inspires me to not just work on ending solitary confinement, not just ending our prison system, but trying to build a better society. And I think that's what we need to take away today.
So I just want to add, because there's all sorts of things that I don't get to put in the film that I feel like when we have these conversations, I was like, oh man, if I could only have put that in, but there was just no room for it. And one of the things, just going off what you said, and you know, it really is a society, a societal issue. So I was talking to these prison architects who you meet in the film, and I was kind of, I was kind of like, oh, well, what kind of person goes into prison architecture? Who decides, like, this is what I want to do? And let's not, and to be honest, I actually got along with them. I think, like, they changed my views on things quite a bit. Not to say, I mean, firstly, I think, there are lots of people, it's no help for any of us to just dismiss any entire class of people. Like, every guard is evil, or that's just not the case. Then we're doing what they're doing, There are people in every position that are actually trying to do something better. Maybe not the majority, but there are always folks who are trying to work within whatever little confines they have. So I felt a lot of them were that. But one of the quotes that stuck to me when I was asking this guy is like, so how did you start building prisons? Like, how did that happen? And he was a really progressive guy, and he was like, well, I really wanted to change the world. When I got out of architecture schools, the early 70s, I wanted to change the world. And I said, okay, well, so the first thing I did is I said, what's the way I can have the best impact on changing the world? I'm going to build public housing. Public housing, these are people who are at the lowest point in society, but if we can build them better housing, if that can be more inspiring space and livable, then, we're just gonna, that's the best way to impact people. And then he said, so we were doing all these government contracts of public housing through the 70s, and they were trying to make as great public housing as they could. And kind of in the late 70s, early 80s, the government contracts they were doing, they said, hey, we don't have any more public housing contracts. We're not going to actually be putting much money into public housing, but we have all this money now to build prisons. Can you guys design some prisons? And I was like, oh my God, like what a metaphor for like what we've done. Like, we just made different types of housing, And so, like, if we don't invest in public housing, if we don't invest in healthcare, if we don't invest in education, that's part of the fight against solitary confinement and the fight against the prisons, right? Is we have to make life outside more palatable for people.
So thank you. I think we can we have time for one more quick question.
I wanted to get back to the film for a moment. I love that encomium given by this 15-year-old turned 27. But how did he meet this guy? They were both in solitary the whole time.
So yes, that's a great question. Herman's situation in solitary, and there are debates around this, but basically he's been in firstly the various levels of solitary or isolation, or whatever you want to call it. At a certain point, he was in a solitary cell where within that 1 hour, he could actually talk to the other people who were in solitary. So he was able to talk, not again, that's not the whole 40 years, because he's been in various points. So in Louisiana, at least at that prison, not all of the solitary units, but some of them, you actually, in your 1 hour out, you can communicate. But that all being said, there were also other ways that he told me that they found ways to communicate just because that you're going to find a way, like that you're trying to do whatever. Like they would play chess with people by notes, like send notes to other people in other cells, and they were playing these chess games on the board because they usually get bored. That's part of it. Is so they were always looking for a way. They were literally banging on walls and communicating because you knew there was a cell next to you. Now that all being said, with Michael, who you mentioned, that was somebody who they were both in a tier where in their 1 hour they were able to communicate with other people on the tier. And I don't know if that is the case in any units in New York or how that works here, but that's how it was in Louisiana.
Just quickly in New York, there are no opportunities like that where people can communicate with each other, although people do find ways to communicate by, again, illegally passing notes to each other, which they could get additional box time for doing, or shouting to each other, which, again, in some facilities, that can get you additional box time as well. There is actually, I just wanted to mention, there is one program at 5 Points Correctional Facility where they actually provide for certain people who've been convicted of sex offenses, a program, it's a new program that they've just started recently, where those people can get out of their cell for 2 hours a day, 3 days a week. And I just mentioned that because it just shows how ridiculous it is that not everybody who's been removed from general population isn't involved in programs, because there's nothing, that program is operating smoothly, there are problems with it, et cetera, but in terms of facility safety or security of the facility, it's operating smoothly and things are happening fine. And it just shows there's no reason why, if somebody had to be separated from general population, why they can't have programs and interaction with other people.
And just one quick note, in New York, these facilities also have double bunked extreme isolation, which presents its own set of problems. That's 2 people in a cell,
2 strangers,
fairly close to the size of the box, maybe a little bit bigger than the one back there, but not much bigger. But living in that space 23 hours per day, that includes going to the bathroom, it includes everything. And the shower is also part of the cell, and there's no privacy, obviously, at all.
So I'm afraid we have to wrap up. You sure? Very short? Okay.
My name is Naomi Jaffe. I'm one of the founders of New York State Prisoner Justice Network, and I'm also a family member of an incarcerated lifer. I've spent a lot of the last 25 years in the visitor rooms of the New York State Maxes. And I wanted us to end this, and everything that everyone has said has been very powerful and very overwhelming and very true about mass incarceration, racism, the culture of punitiveness and violence. I want to end with another side of it. In the 5 years that we've been in New York State Prisoner Justice Network, an alternative has emerged. Something has really shifted in the culture in this country. It hasn't been reflected yet in letting a lot of people out of prison, but what we have is a grassroots a set of grassroots movements that have emerged in the last few years. In New York State, we have 60, 70, 80 organizations of advocacy. The campaign against isolated confinement is a wonderful model for those others, but it's not the only one. We've got very powerful campaigns against the injustice of the parole system. We've begun to have a campaign against keeping aging people in prison forever. There were campaigns about innocence. There has been we have had an impact on a public dialogue that was completely invisible 5 years ago. 5 years ago, all the issues that we're talking about today, with films, and this isn't the only film that's come out about the injustices, we have started to expose the injustices and to create an environment of a narrative about them where at least these issues are in contention. And so while everyone has been saying this is what we need to do, I want to let you know that it's already started. There are movements that you can join and that you can be part of, and the campaign against isolated confinement is one of them. And if people on the stage would like to say a few words about the emergence of our movements for justice, that would be I think that would be a way for us to end, because it's such an overwhelming and sobering problem. How can people find out about the New York Prisoner Justice Network? NYSprisonerjustice.org.
Any closing thoughts about?
Yes. Imprisonment, first of all, thank you so much, and what your group have done, and so many other groups out there. So prison incorporates so many different devices of torture and abuse that there's so many groups out there doing a lot. And even if you feel parole needs to be helped, join on that. Even if you feel that the point where children are incarcerated, there's many groups doing that. But it just takes an effort, and it's going to take the people. And just like other atrocities in this world has been overcome, it just takes the people to say, we're tired of this and we're going to make change. So no matter where you make change, that change is necessary and it's needed. And over the last few years, there has been an outspurt of growth in grassroots organizations. And grassroots means that it's just the people standing up for other people, saying this is inhumane and we're going to stay together on this. So whatever angle you take, please, take that angle.
I'll just add a couple specifics about some campaigns that are happening. As I mentioned before, Campaign for Alternatives to Isolated Confinement, I hope you'll sign up in the back. The website for that is nyclaic.org. In addition, there is, as was just mentioned, a strong campaign to push for some legislation called the Safe Parole Act. And the New York State Prisoner Justice Network and others have been working on that. And I just want to relate that to the film again, because Herman Wallace, you walk away from it saying, this is an inspiring person, not an inspiring person in prison. This is an inspiring person who could transform my life. But I have to tell you that Herman Wallace is not alone in that. I have met so many individuals who are currently or formerly incarcerated in New York State prisons who have that same awe-inspiring feel to them. They are regular human beings. There are so many people like them inside of prison, but there are so many who have gone through a number of years of incarceration and need to come home, and we need to do a lot of work. And there's a related project called the RAP Project, Release of Aging People in Prison, that I hope people will get involved in as well. I also want to mention, because it also relates to the film about young people in prison, there's a campaign going around called Raise the Age campaign. And in New York State, we're only one of 2 states in the whole country where 16 and 17-year-olds are tried as adults automatically, regardless of the crime for which they are being charged. And so there's a campaign to raise that age to at least 18, if not 21 or higher, so that people are not charged as adults and not sent to adult prison. So again, that's 3 main campaigns. Let's get elderly people out of prison. Let's raise the age of criminal responsibility, and let's end solitary confinement. And again, NYCLU.org is the website for that. Also, correctionalassociation.org is the website for the organization that I work for. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you very much to all the panelists. Oh, and Stop Solitary? And StopSolitary.com is another great resource. And thank you all so much for coming. We'll all stick around for a few more minutes if you want to talk. There's still, I think, some more food in the back as well. So thank you all for coming, and please stay in touch.